Saturday, 11 December 2011. It was supposed to be just another auction at the magnificent Quinn Rock Wine Estate.
A very warm welcome to you. My name is Rael Levitt. I'm your auctioneer here today. This property is prime.
Just another day in Rael Levitt's glittering 20-year career as CEO of Auction Alliance, the industry pioneers. The gavel dropped. Then, disaster struck. A powerful billionaire buyer accused him of using a ghost bidder to inflate the bid price. Rael's reputation was soon in tatters. The media-driven scandal pursued him like the relentless killer waves he narrowly escaped in Thailand during the 2004 tsunami.
More than 11,000 people are now thought to have been killed in southern Asia after an undersea...
And the high-profile face of South African auctions seemingly sank without a trace. A decade later, Rael is back. He's the CEO and founder of an even bigger business. The grit, determination, insights, and self-belief required came from surviving 2 tsunamis in his life and getting back up again. He learned many powerful, valuable lessons about business and entrepreneurship, but also about humility and digging deep within. As Rael says, sometimes it takes a tsunami to discover what you're made of. And the greater the tsunami, the greater the lesson. This is Rael's story.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. The noonday gun has just gone off here in our Cape Town studio where we are based, which signals the start of our weekly webinar. And welcome to today's weekly webinar hosted by REI on Wednesdays and Thursdays. Thank you for joining us. And today's masterclass webinar is brought to you and hosted by a real estate investor in conjunction with Inospace, alongside our guest speaker, CEO and founder, Rael Levitt, who also authored a book called It Takes a Tsunami, who I'll introduce to you all very shortly. And today is the third installment of our exciting new series, Property Entrepreneurs and Authors and Their Personal, Business and Real Estate Investment Journeys. Today and going forward over the next few months, we have a fantastic lineup of esteemed property professionals, investors and business people who have also become authors, who will be sharing their insights, experiences and inspiration in the world of real estate, investment and business. So our goal with this webinar series is to bring you closer to some of the industry's most influential property players and authors, and allowing you the opportunity to learn from their triumphs and their challenges. And each session of these series will be joined by one of these accomplished entrepreneurs who have not only written extensively about real estate investment, who have also walked the talk by successfully building their own property portfolios and businesses. My name is Neale Petersen. I'm the founder and content chief of Real Estate Investor, South Africa's leading independent real estate, digital magazine, content and education platform for more than 16 years. And at REI, we're really passionate about serving the South African and global real estate and business community through our digital platform, rei.co.za, and our monthly digital magazine, Real Estate Investor. Also our webinars, our live events and educational material. So I'm really honored and to be your host and moderator for today's webinar. So before we dive in today's masterclass, first some housekeeping. If you do accidentally log out by some chance, just remember to use the same link as before. You will get back in. And for registered attendees who could not attend today's live version of the webinar, you will receive a recording link of the webinar via email. Alternatively, you can access event play recordings under the education tab on the rei.co.za website. So I'd like to remind you of this interactive experience. So throughout this webinar, we encourage you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A box, the chat feature, which is located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And we'll reserve some time at the end of the masterclass session to address as many of your questions and queries as possible. So moving on to our topic for today, the rise, fall and rise of the South African entrepreneur. And today we have a very special guest who will be sharing his remarkable journey and insights into the world of property entrepreneurship in South Africa. And our guest needs little introduction to those familiar with the real estate industry. Rel is an entrepreneur. He's an author and business leader from South Africa, and he's founded multiple real estate investment, asset management, and auction companies throughout his career. He is a double master's degree graduate from the University of California, Los Angeles, Anderson School of Management, and the National University of Singapore. As the former CEO of Auction Alliance, he has left an indelible mark in the industry, revolutionizing the auction sector, and was part of countless property transactions. And today, Rael is the CEO of Inospace, an owner and operator of branded business parks in South Africa and the UK. He's not only seen multiple economic cycles over his long career, he's faced a number of triumphs and hardships, which he will share today. He also recently authored a book called It Takes a Tsunami. And today we are really privileged to hear from Rael himself as he shares his lessons from his life story today. So without further ado, please join me in extending a warm virtual welcome to Rael Levitt. Rael, thank you for being here. We eagerly await the invaluable insights that you will share with us today.
Thank you, Neale, and hopefully we can share them. I mean, it has been, one doesn't feel like a veteran in property, but it's amazing. If you read the book, I started when I was 17 in real estate, so I pretty much am a veteran, seeing a few cycles and a few ups and downs.
Absolutely. So, Rael, let's just start off. What inspired you to write the book, It Takes a Tsunami? I mean, I've read it from cover to cover, and I found it really, it was a truly exhilarating read.
Well, I mean, Neale, and as I explained in the book, when I first wrote it, it was very much like therapy by memoir. So it was just after Auction Alliance I closed Auction Alliance in 2012, and I wanted to get my version sort of out there, and so I started writing, and then it became very much like therapy. I mean, every time I'd have like sort of a rough moment, I was sort of writing the book. So initially, that was the major part of it. It also was that I'd kept very quiet about what had happened. And attorneys after a while said to me, listen, you're just not winning the media war. No matter what you say, you're putting fuel on the fire. So instead of sort of doing a Donald Trump, they told me to take stum powder. They said, keep quiet. And so I didn't say anything. And, what happens is if you don't say anything, in fact, it's not a great thing, because in many ways, sometimes the fire does go out. So I wanted to get my side of the story out and explain what had happened. That was like the initial sort of thing. And then as it went along, it literally was 10 years, more than 10 years after Auction Alliance had closed down and restarted a new business. I thought I'd like a couple of valuable lessons, probably more on the disaster side than on the positive side. I thought it'd be nice to tell the story, and really COVID inspired, because during COVID, the whole world went a bit crazy. A lot of people were in a bad space, and really the sort of the message of the book is that you can go through difficult times, but life is full of ups and downs, and it's luck and it's disaster. And so I thought I would come out and sort of tell a motivational story. So that's really the sort of background of why I wrote it. It's been an interesting book.
Excellent. No, well, look, I mean, you definitely had a barrage of media against you, and I think it's the right thing to do. Everybody deserves a second chance. But Rael, tell us, where did your career start first? I mean, in the real estate game and then into auctions. I mean, you mentioned earlier 17 years old. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so what had really happened was my late father ran a small legal practice out in Bellville in the Cape Town suburbs. My mother had sort of assisted my dad in the practice. She was quite shrewd in sort of property. My parents had speculated that as a kid, property was always a conversation going around the table. My mother used to help my dad in his practice on real estate, on transfers, and of course, she started selling homes. And it was dinner table conversation. It was something that we were always interested in. I had an interest. And so as a kid, I used to go out with my mom, and she used to sell houses out largely in the Cape Flats, which in those days was very unusual. And so when I finished school in those days, I finished at 17. When I finished, I was a little bit young for my year, but as I finished school, I started, even before I had a driver's license, I started selling homes. And I started selling homes out in the Cape Flats. this was like right at the end of the apartheid era. You're talking sort of just before the change had happened, but the Group Areas Act was still around, and then it was probably quite unusual to see a little chubby Jewish boy cruising around Downs and Northbound and Brackenfell and Mitchell's Plain. People often thought I was either the security police or I was an evangelist, but I was a property evangelist, and it was a market one had really focused on. The traditional bigger state agencies were focusing on Bantry Bay and Bishop's Court. It wasn't really a market they wanted to cover, largely because it was a tumultuous period. It was and at that very stage, interest rates shoot up to an all-time high. Now, if we know today, interest rates are 12.75%. In the sort of early 90s, interest rates peak at about 24.5%. So there were a huge number of repossessed properties, and I would go out and I would start selling them. My father wanted me to become a lawyer. It was also the era, Neale, you may remember, you're probably a bit younger than me, there was a thing called the army. So sort of nice white boys from the suburbs had a choice. You either go study or you had to go to the army. And so, of course, I was not going to the army. And so I had to go to UCT. And while I was at UCT, I was selling homes I was selling really homes, and they were sort of, low end prices to people at UCT campus. And then one day out of the blue, the Permanent Building Society, Permanent Bank actually, subsequently became part of Nedbank. All these banks were just repossessing homes at an enormous scale because of the high interest rates, and high interest rates are very bad for property. And they came up with a scheme, and they said, look, if you buy a home today, you don't have to put any money down, and you can pay us in over 3 years. And I remember asking my dad, I said, listen, you think I could do this? And so he said yes. And so at the sort of tender age of 19, 18, 19, I buy my first home out in an area called Blue Downs. I buy this home. It was all of 17,000 Rand. What was the price? I had sort of accumulated some property commissions, which I used to renovate this home. It was vandalized, actually. And I sold it to a woman and a husband who worked at UCT. I used to take out every day at the end of UCT, I used to take the staff home. I called it the lift to buy scheme, because they all had these from the university, and they could buy homes. And so I sold this home, and then I started renovating it with the sort of scrabbling together the commissions I had, and a little bit of my bar mitzvah money, which I kept since I was 13. And so, and it really wasn't, in those days I bought the home for 17,000. It cost me sort of another 10,000 to renovate, and I sold it for 70,000, which was like a whopping profit at that point. In event, in the sort of summer of 1990, I was outside this house learning how to lay bricks, and was using my mom's car to ferry the tiles and the various other things. And a chap drives past in a white vehicle. Initially, I thought it was the police, but it wasn't a police car. And a chap calls me over, and he says to me, look, he was looking for a street. And of course, to this day, I remember the name. He was looking for a street called Happiness Street. And and this is obviously, this is the era before, Google Maps or Waze or GPS. We used to have these old map books, but they hadn't even had map books out in Blue Downs yet. It was such a new area, but I knew my way around. And so, because I'd been selling there. So I take him to his house, and it turns out that this guy was the sheriff of the court. And he does an auction, and I'm standing there. I've never been to an auction before. I'm 20 years old at the time, and he actually was about 19. I wasn't even 20 yet. And there were two guys there wearing suits, which I later discovered came from the bank. And there was no one besides me. And the sheriff says, are there any bids? The guy from the bank puts his hand up. He says 10 Rand. And the sheriff says sold. And I'm going, okay, hold on a second. Yeah, I was a nice Jewish boy. If I could buy it for 11 Rand, would I be able to buy it? He says, come to my office on Monday, and I'll explain to you how sales and execution, which is the sort of the repossession process, works. And of course, the newspapers, which is something people don't know what those are, but Neale, just to remind you, it was like this big piece of paper which came out every morning, and they were filled with these sales and execution notices. And so I started attending sales and execution just because the sheriff said to me, listen, so, these are interesting. And I literally would go every single day of my life. I'd go to UCT. I would, much to my father's dislike, I would disappear at 12 o'clock, and I would go to the sheriff's auction, sometimes at the magistrate's courts. And the one day the sheriff said to me, look, today is a lucky day. And I was out in an area called North Pine, which is near Brackenfell, and in Brackenfell. And he said to me, look, the bank only wants, it was Trust Bank, they only wanted sort of 27,000 Rand for a home, which I knew was worth way more than that. And so I sort of put my hand up and I bought this property at my first auction. And so I bought a 27. I went back to UCT. I found somebody else who wanted to buy a home, and I sold the home to them it was an empty home at a considerable profit. And so I became property investor at the sort of tender age of, I was under 21. In fact, I remember when, it was much easier in those days than today. There wasn't so much regulation and red tape that you see today. And I just started buying and selling homes. And so I realized, and literally by my 21st birthday, I bought sort of 20 odd homes. And then I realized real estate is all about cash flow. And the one day, all these transfers are coming through. I had to take transfers of the home. I wasn't selling them quick enough, and I realized I was going to run out of cash. And so I sort of went home and I thought, well, how on earth am I going to make cash quickly? And I couldn't do it waitering. I couldn't do anything else. And so hold on a second. Attending all these auctions, they're so badly run, and they were run by the sheriff. Could I do them? And I had known all these bankers because I used to attend all the auctions, and I approached one of them, and I landed up, which is just how my book starts, actually. It's right at the start. I landed with Absa Bank, and the then regional general manager had just come down. Absa was an amalgamation of 4 banks: Trust Bank, Allied, Volkswagen, and United. And they had big problems on their hands. They had kaka, as we say in Cape Town, because they had so many possessions. Interest rates were really killing the market. And so, and no one wanted to do auctions in the sort of previously disadvantaged areas. And I put my hand up. And so I get my first auction, and I became an auctioneer, having no experience or at all. And my very first auction was a large one. It was 31 bank repossessed properties, literally 2 months after my 21st birthday. And so that's how I got into auctions, which I did for 20 years, from the age of 20 to 40, exactly.
Wonderful. No, there's just so many lessons within there, Rel. Like, you can see you're an action taker, an entrepreneur. You see opportunity, you jump onto it. And I think just listening to you can see that's how you kind of like, through walking the streets, doing the deals, that kind of stuff is really where it's got you today, it's fantastic. It's wonderful to hear. So just tell us a little bit about Auction Alliance, because, I remember Auction Alliance very clearly back in the day. Real Estate Investors started in 2007. You were known as the biggest auction company in South Africa, and you were doing really industry pioneering things. So maybe just share with the audience, how did you do that?
Yeah, Neale, so when you started in 2007, Auction Alliance was now peaking, and it really had become the largest auction company in South Africa by far. In fact, 60% of the entire auction market of South Africa was Auction Alliance, and these are 6 out of every 10 auctions that we were conducting. We started in a good year. It was just before the global financial crisis, and Auction Alliance had grown into a large business. Now, if I rewind back to my 21st birthday, when I conducted my first auction, in fact, it was an Auction Alliance. And so I started off in a business which I literally, on my 21st, I finished my undergraduate. I decided not to complete law, and I started Lefco, which was my name. And Lefco was, I started it in Bellville, and Lefco Auctions was the first sort of iteration of my meeting auctions. I did that for 3 years, and in 1995, the SEEF group were very dynamic property people, if you remember back to that era.
Yes.
Under Lawrence SEEF and his brother Samuel, very dynamic property people, and they'd grown this large property group, larger than just residential. SEEF today is probably known larger as residential, but they'd grown into commercial property. They subsequently went into SEEF Trust, which became their first cousin, Mike Flax, and he subsequently listed a company, and they were doing home loans. And so they approached me and they wanted to buy the business. And so at the sort of tender age of 24, I sold out because I was going to go live in Australia. That was, so I sold out, and I went to work at SEEF as an employee. The only time I've ever been an employee, and I was the MD of their auction division. That lasted until SEEF itself sold out to Brait. Brait was a big investment company, And CIF listed the company. I was there. In fact, I was the only post-acquisition listing, which they did. But I had a great time at CIF, and the business grew. We took over Boland Bank Auctions, which was in that era, Boland Bank, also today part of Nedbank. Boland was big in the platteland, so they did cattle and farm auctions. And to have a bank as a partner in auction business was really, for me, it was a great attraction. And so Auction Alliance really happened because CIF, they sell out to Brait, and Brait then decides to sort of, these corporate, as always happens in corporate stories, that they bought CIF because they wanted CIF, and then they basically split it up and they sell off the bits and pieces. And so the CIF brothers bought what is today CIF Estate Agents back. Mike Flax then bought, which was CIF Trust, and later he renamed it Spearhead and listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They had a mortgage division, which became Mortgage SA, today Uber, and then there was the auction division. And I bought CIF Auctions back, and I couldn't use their name. That was the deal. I could only use their name for 1 year, and I was desperately looking for a name, and I called it Auction Alliance. And so Auction Alliance really starts on my sort of when I turned 27, and initially we focused on insolvency because it was still sort of distressed periods, and then literally at sort of the turn of the millennium, 2000, the property market takes a big turn. And why it takes a big turn is because the rand, which had weakened, actually caused a lot of investors to invest in South Africa. And so all of a sudden there was buyers around, and especially in where I was operating in Cape Town, the sort of Atlantic seaboard, there were a lot of buyers around. And you then start having the great property boom, and interest rates really just start dropping down, the rand strengthens, and I was then very concerned in Auction Alliance that the insolvency and the sort of distress part of the business was disappearing because markets were improving. And so because I'd been to Australia so often, I'd seen how in Australia, the vast majority of properties are sold by auction, or auction as they like to call it. And I spent some time in Australia. And came back, and I had an idea to create what we call multiple property auctions, what they do today. When you go to a hotel room, we were already doing them online. And so that was the great shift in Auction Alliance. And the market which we sort of stumbled onto was commercial property, because the commercial property market, there were lots of auctioneers doing furniture and cattle and cars and all this, but there were almost no commercial property auctioneers. And so initially we were quite big in residential, and then we went to commercial property, and commercial property had a great run, if anyone remembers. And it was just a huge period of consolidation between the sort of old insurance company, Sanlam and Old Mutual, and they were selling off. That was the rise at the beginning of the REITs, and there was huge trading going on, and we focused on commercial property. So to fast forward the story, by the time we launched multiple auctions, the company just started growing. I opened up branches all over the country in a very short period: Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria, Port Elizabeth, Windhoek, Nelspruit. We went into the sort of neighboring countries, ultimately actually opening up an office in Dubai in that sort of 2007 period. And so the company boomed. The profits shot up. We came with a whole new innovative model of how we conduct auctions. Auctioneers had always been the sort of auctioneer was the salesman, and we grew a huge team of salespeople. We had about 120 salespeople. Many of the people who came through the Auction Alliance University, I've remained in contact with them. Many well-known names in the property business today. I'd worked at Auction Alliance. And we at that, sort of by that 2007 or sort of up to 2010, we had grown, we had over 300 people working in branches, and ultimately selling billions of rands worth of real estate and other assets. I mean, we didn't only do real estate. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm compressing it a sort of a 20-year story in a few minutes, but it really grew into a considerable company, and it changed the way people transacted. And I suppose looking back, what it really did is the commercial property market, probably more than most, had been an old boys club. And, people knew, there were certain brokers everybody knew, there was a couple of the big REITs, and we opened it up, and we created a very transparent and open stock market. It was huge advertising. I mean, I remember in those days, I'm talking about newspapers, we used to advertise. I mean, we had advertising spends that ran into millions. We used to take out pages and pages in the newspaper and attracted a whole crowd of people who had never been exposed to commercial property into sort of a retail atmosphere, you know, retail theatre.
So you've taken the business, I mean, you grew it. I mean, being a Cape Town boy, which is predominantly a sort of, you had a predominantly Cape Town based business. I mean, you took it national, you took it international and grew it into a really big business. There's also a lot of deja vu that you're talking about there, weakened rand currencies, also interest rates, which we're kind of going through now as well, which is quite interesting that we do go through these different cycles all the time. But
I mean, that you raise such an interesting point, because when you look at real estate, actually, and I was talking the other day about it, like, in fact, the irony is that it was always in the very downturns where all the great innovations and new companies arose. I mean, even if you look at companies and, you know, like Growthpoint, South Africa's largest REIT, I mean, Growthpoint came out from a hugely distressed period. I mean, if you talk to I bumped the CEO Norbert Sass the other day on the beach and walking his dog. And I chatted to him, he said, you know, when I went to, he was an investor. When I went to Growthpoint, I was scared that I wouldn't even be able to get a salary because it was such an unpopular sector. It was a no to go there. And Redefine also came out, you know, when Mark Wayner put it together in a very distressed period. And so distressed times were the greatest opportunity. But, you know, it's our natural human condition to, when, you know, when times are good, we want to be there. And when times are bad, we don't want to be. So, of course, there's no question in my mind we're going to see a whole new breed of property people. You know, there's going to be some 21-year-old or 30-year-old watching this and suddenly realize, wow, this is a moment. Because it really is the greatest innovation, and in real estate particularly, because, you know, people run into sectors and they run out of sectors, and you know, in the greatest times there's disruption and things change. And so the story of Auction Lines was actually that. It really grew out of very sort of difficult times, and it wasn't always easy. I mean, the global financial crisis in 2009, which South Africa avoided, was a huge period for us. We had to then change the model again, because now it had to go back to distress sales. And so, you know, we did some big innovations in that period as well, working with the banks. And so, of course, you know, markets go up and down, and one's life goes up and down. And I think it's really, I suppose that's ultimately the story of my book. Is actually it takes the difficult times where great businesses are born. It takes the difficult times to show what you're made of.
Absolutely. Okay, now getting to the part where, you know, disaster struck. And so run us through the story. What happened? And in fact, I was supposed to be there myself. I was invited, and unfortunately I couldn't make it on the day. I remember December 2011, Coin Rock Wine Estate. And so tell us what actually happened on the day, on that fateful day of December 11.
Well, when you come back to coming back to the book, in fact, I only get to the Coin Rock story 2/3 of the way through, because it is such an interesting property story. But so I only get to Coin Rock 2. But 2011, you know, I've been in the auction business now 20 years. I just turned 40, so I'd been in many years. I was a bit of the poster boy of auctions in the country. And what had happened was we had quite a large, what we call agricultural division, because as I mentioned earlier, we had taken up Boerland Bank, and they were in the Cape Platteland. It's a Stellenbosch in that sort of Boerland area. We had an office in Paarl. It was always a big market of ours. And, you know, although we were nice Jewish boys from Sea Point, we were boerafslaers. So you had ons we had a lot of exposure to that market. And so, you know, at that point, we also, like, as I said to you, we were 60% of the market, and people would approach us. And so what happened was we were approached by the South African Revenue Services, SARS. And SARS approached one of the chaps who worked for me, and they told the story that they had an exposure to, there was a guy called Dave and Dave King had been having the charges. It was really a messy affair, but they had this wine estate that was called Coin Rock. In fact, in my book, I call it a rock in the road. And so how did I get introduced to the Coin Rock was SARS came to us and they wanted me to auction it. And right from the start, SARS, you know, Dave King believed the farm was worth over 200 million rand. SARS thought it was worth 120. And so the auction day was set. We weren't even going to do it. It was one of those things. It was on the 10th of December. It was very late. I was going overseas a few days later. And so, and it was, the media picked up on the story because it was Dave King was such a big story. And then, it was Stellenbosch and it was Jan Rupert and it was all the sort of various other names. And so really what happened at the auction was that SARS had told me they wanted 75 million rand for the farm. Now, the whole story and the whole scandal revolves around ghost bidding, but really how it works today, how it worked then, how it worked 100 years ago, and was that at auction sales, the seller would want a reserve, and the job of the auctioneer was to get to the reserve, and so we would put people people at the auction to bid up to the seller's reserve. People never really understood that, like ghost bidding, and it used to kill me reading these articles. People said about ghost bidding, but vendor bidding was legal, and they didn't quite explain what the difference was. But in essence, it was to protect the reserve. And if you think about it, Neale, if you're selling your home, and you come along to the estate agent, and the estate agent says, what do you want for your home? I said, listen, I want 5 million rand for my home. And so if somebody brings you an offer of 2 million, give me 5, got my price. And so all really auctions were what was known as sort of vendor bidding was really to protect the seller's reserve. And so the issue at Quinrock and the difference was actually in the very year that auction happened was the Consumer Protection Act comes out. It was a new act, and there'd never been any reference in law in South Africa to auctions, nothing, not one reference. But suddenly the Consumer Protection Act starts dealing with auctions. And of course, the irony of my life, I was on the board of the Auctioneers Institute, and I was the one working with the Department of Justice and this new consumer body to help them do these laws, because I traveled all around the world, I understood vendor bidding. And so in essence, what had happened was on the day of the auction, I used somebody to push up the price, and the property was knocked down. It was very sort of well reputed for 55 million. I instantly knew that Wendy Applebaum was the highest bidder. She wasn't going to get it because they wanted 75. And the media always made the story that Wendy Applebaum bought the property and then she got defrauded by Rael Levitt and the sale fell through. But in fact, it was never a sale in the first place because SARS rejected the bid. They were my clients. And but the mistake I made, and I made so many mistakes there, one mistake after the other. The mistake I made was when Wendy Applebaum inquires who's bidding against her, instead of saying to her, look, this was our vendor bidder, so it's a cheap price, SARS price, my staff initially and then myself tell her another story. And so in essence, we had lied to Wendy Applebaum, but really sort of got her back up. And, people always ask me, what would you have done differently? Well, I said, well, 1 cup of coffee would have sort of changed the trajectory of my life, because it was true. In fact, she actually sent me an SMS saying, let's have a cup of coffee. And I sort of rejected it because I knew the price was too low.
So why did you reject
and so well, SARS rejected the price. It wasn't me. SARS said, look, it was worth more. They subsequently sold it a few months later to a person who still owns it today. It was a Ukrainian businessman, bought it for 75 million. The price was simply too low. And so her price was rejected and she didn't want to go up. But 2 months later, she sort of, the story starts, somehow the Sunday Times gets onto the story. And the Sunday Times asked Wendy Applebaum what had happened. And she was irate about this. And she said, well, she sort of she lays a complaint at the Consumer Commissioner. And from that story came the big ghost bidding scandal of 2012. And it was an enormous story. It was, I suppose when I look back, it was sort of like way out really what it was about. But the media loved the story. It was a sort of high-flying auctioneer versus the wealthiest woman in the country, a billionaire. And the authorities took it very, very quickly. The story then morphed further, went into a much greater story. And then it became a story of auction alliances, entire practices, and were we using people to push up at every auction? Many of the other auctions, not all of them, say, oh, we don't do this, we never do it, it's not us, it's them, but it's absolutely, auctions work exactly in the same way. What they called ghost bidding and vendor bidding is exactly the same thing, except vendor bidding is disclosed. And so they put a little clause. If you go to an auction today, tomorrow, there'll be a clause in the contract that says the auctioneer reserves the right to bid up to the reserve price. And that's the difference between ghost bidding and vendor bidding. It's the disclosure of it. And so the truth is that authorities actually decide now they need to act. And so they, in fact, not only now am I dealing with total decimation of the business, because no one wanted to come to Auction Alliance after that. Not only that, I then had authorities, and I faced multiple authorities. It was the Consumer Commissioner, and she literally said she wanted to put me in jail. And it landed up where Wendy Applebaum herself lays a police complaint accusing me of fraud, trying to defraud her at the auction sale. And then it morphed into this sort of hawks and legal cases. And so in early 2012, not long after the scandal erupted, I just thought to myself, look, I've been in this business 20 years and I cannot fight this battle to keep the business around and fight the hawks and fight the media. And so I literally shut the entire operation down. I never liquidated it, I just shut it down. And I decided to come back and fight another day, which I actually did a few years after that.
That's fantastic. So, Rel, did we just, first of all, hindsight, they say, is a real fine sight, What would you have done differently? Because, once the media got hold of this, it was, everybody was publishing stuff. I mean, it was Sunday Times, it was Business Day, it was a carte blanche, it went across very wide. And was this not maybe an opportunity maybe to present the story? So maybe my question to you is, how would you have done that differently? And as I say, it's easy.
Oh, Lord, well, I would have done everything differently. I mean, I shouldn't admit it. I mean, I totally messed it up. And it was so ironic because up to then I sort of, in my mind, I've done everything right. I mean, it was a hugely humbling experience because for somebody, I'd really got a lot right in my life. And all of a sudden, it was just like disaster after disaster after disaster. And I really, in many ways, I feel that. So, I mean, the first thing, and it's the first thing I should have done was I literally should have gone to sit down with Wendy Applebaum and explained what happened. But I didn't. I ducked it. And people are like, why did you duck it? Well, there was a few reasons. Number one, I was a bit scared of her. I'd heard she was a tough cookie and she was this billionaire, and I was like, no, and I was a bit scared of her, and I thought it would go away. That was the first big mistake. The second was when the media, and really was, it was a couple of journalists, carte blanche loved the story, and there was this whole story of me, which was completely untrue. And they rang my doorbell, and then they said I put on a voice, but it made for great TV viewing. So, but initially I was quite aggressive, actually, with the media. I should have rather been far more humble. And so I was quite arrogant with the media. And then, of course, the bigger mistake was that I took an aggressive legal stance. And so, in fact, I sued Wendy Applebaum for defamation. I take the Argus to the independent newspapers at the time. I actually tried to bring an application for them to stop writing about the story. And, of course, that was like real fuel on the fire. And so that was the next mistake. And then I totally go quiet. And so from taking that, and I disappear. And so by being totally quiet, I literally allowed people to write whatever they want. And it was just the beginning of social media, people really started writing whatever they wanted. And so keeping quiet was also, it was probably a right legal strategy. I mean, my lawyer said to me, like, just keep quiet. Whatever you're going to say, you're just not going to win. And so I kept totally quiet, and that sort of created the impression of this sort of like crooked businessman who couldn't even defend himself. It was couldn't defend himself, and so and then then I sort of spiraled into a very negative space, emotionally, psychologically. It was being an auctioneer was part of my identity. It wasn't just a job, and the whole disappeared. I mean, this company, which was making profits of close to 100 million rand, with billions of rand of turnover, literally just disappears overnight. And added to that, I was like doing nothing. And so I really go into a very bad space, with a lot of therapy and time, and sort of spend respectively on what I did wrong. It was a difficult moment, and I did a lot wrong. And looking back, could I have saved it? possibly in the beginning. I think the authorities really liked the story. It was like, we're going to clean up this auction business. And so, the other day I was at one of our big investors, a chap by the name of Jonathan Bear, and I bumped him actually in London, and he read my book. He said, I don't know why you ever closed that business down. And so I even, for a long time, I wasn't sure if I should have, maybe I should have battled it through, and it would have been fine. Many of the people who worked at auction, most of the auctioneers today, sort of the vast majority, came out of auction alliance, whether it's Broll or Orcor or High Street Auction. They were all ex-auction alliance people. They just went on to, everybody went into glittering careers afterwards.
Fantastic. Interesting, Rel. I actually, know Derek Watt's carte blanche and everything. And one of the comments he made, he said if Rael Levitt had probably faced up to, maybe gave yourself the story, it could have actually been in your favor. It could have actually been.
Yeah, I mean, Derek is probably right. I mean, I also bumped him one day, and we actually had a bit of a laugh about it. I must see he's not well.
Yes.
Actually, a lot because when carte blanche arrives at the carte blanche was like sort of Finding Nemo, and they were they popped up at my office in Joburg, and they came to my office in Cape Town, they came to my house in Joburg. And I literally was like, if there was true, I was the carte blanche arrived, I ducked out the side door. One of my staff today runs Orcor Property, took me. I was cowering the back of his car, and so I ducked that story, and they went to town. I mean, I don't know if I would have won with carte blanche that day, but probably. I mean, I probably could have faced the story, but I mean, the truth was, I had no emotional capacity to handle it. I had never. I mean, this is like the irony of my story, was that I'd never. It wasn't like sort of like bad, negative news. I was like the glory boy. I mean, the irony was that in December 2011, Ernst & Young had sort of pitched me as the Global Entrepreneur of the Year award with these large outsized photos of me all over their building. And then 2 months later, Ernst & Young were the ones the state agents board sent in to do sort of a forensic investigation. And so I'd never dealt with bad media. There was never one negative article about auction lines in 20 years. And all of a sudden, I was the poster boy. I was like a mix of Madoff and Saddam Hussein combined as one terrible human being. And I sort of use the words in the book. It was like being a distorted mirror at a fun fair. I was just made out to be this absolute rogue and thief and crook and town and years, actually.
So I want to get into the story where you rise again first, but before we get there, I mean, Rael, it's very difficult. You imagine, after the period of Auction Alliance, that, I mean, it took you a few years to sort of recover, get back on your feet, look at what your next maneuvers are after you close down Auction Alliance. And also, I know you've got family overseas, and surely I think that was what could have been on your radar screen. And the interesting thing is that you probably had the opportunity maybe to immigrate, to start another business in another country, and yet you decided to continue your new business venture, Inospace, in South Africa. Why?
So what really happened was that I have a sister that she immigrated many years ago in Southern California, and my brother founded a business called Gift with a quite a well-known entrepreneur called Vinnie Lingham, and he went to Northern California, and so it was a little bit, for me, it was a bit obvious that I would sort of follow them. And I started looking. I didn't know what to do with myself. I often feel very sorry for sort of 18-year-olds because they need to. I knew what I wanted to do immediately after school, and all of a sudden I was in this quandary, and I literally lost like my decision making. I don't think anyone's been in that. I was depressed, I didn't know what to do. And so I decided to go back because I'd left university. I always wanted to go back. And I go back and I go to UCLA. And while I'm at UCLA, I literally sit down and I write down everything I did wrong. And I literally sort of, it was a great period for me. And so I was going to go live in America. I got offered a job actually as an auctioneer in San Diego. And I was very keen. And but I just felt that I had unfinished business back in South Africa, and I didn't want to leave South Africa sort of under a cloud. In fact, I went to the UK. I was going to buy an auction business there, and I remember the chap I was going to buy it from gave me good advice. He said, listen, if you come to the UK with a murky sort of past, you're going to find it difficult to get business here. And so I decided to come back to South Africa, and it was when I came back to South Africa, I really didn't know what to do, and I I bumped into somebody I'd known from Investec Bank, and they said, that they would back me and in something. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And I had contacts in South Africa, and, South Africa is very much a place where, it's a small pond, and you can move quite quickly. And so I found it actually quite easy to operate in South Africa. And I literally thought I'd unfinished business, and I like South Africa. I think South Africa is a country of opportunity. I think all the disaster creates that opportunity. I think that we are a resilient people. And so I decided to come back to South Africa, and I literally then I did a further master's degree in Singapore. And so I then, while I'm still traveling, I get involved and I buy my first industrial property, which I'd never known before, in Epping in Cape Town, which was the first property which became Inospace.
Okay, excellent. Now we're moving on to the next phase over here. And I think it's really been a fascinating story so far, Rel, and it really, to put yourself out there like this in your book, so to remind everybody here, it takes a tsunami. There's going to be a link in the box. You'll have an opportunity to buy the book. I just want to mention that all the profits of the book is going through a charity. I'm not sure which charity it is, Rel, but I know it has been sent through there is a charity that he is sending it through to various charities. So let's talk a little bit about, sort of the next phase now. You built yourself a new business. And so maybe let's talk a little bit about now Inospace and where you are now, and where do you want it to go?
So Inospace was also an overnight success story, which took 5 years. Auction Alliance was an overnight success story, which took 15 years. So I grew the business. It really became, there hasn't been a huge growth in South African property funds. A lot of people are quite negative. If you look at the share prices of the REITs today, it's become a sort of quite quickly quite an unsexy industry. But despite that, against that grain, which is probably my view of life, is that when times are tough, that's when opportunity opens. So we grew the business. It's at the moment it's about a fund worth about 3.25 billion rand. We have 52 of these service logistics parks in the country. In Cape Town and Johannesburg, we did open one up in the UK just before COVID happened. And so it's grown into a pretty, listen, compared to a REIT, it's small, but certainly for a private company, it's a pretty large company. And it's been also innovative and quite disruptive in South Africa. It's a branded property platform. It's hugely flexible. We have a lot of flexible leases. We've got a lot of products which are smaller sizes. So the business grew last year, was quite a post-COVID as well. Again, my view of life, I should have bought more during COVID. It was like when COVID, everybody thought life was going to end. But when COVID arrived, and that's actually how I end my book, when COVID arrived, I went, okay, this is just another tsunami. And those who jump in this moment will actually do well. But we concluded a deal, started talking to Fortress REIT. It was a 1.25 billion rand transaction with Fortress, which doubled the size of the business. And so the last year has been sort of settling the assets down. We grew to 52 parks. The next phase of Inospace, as I spoke to you before, we live in an environment, so high interest rates and inflation obviously affect us as well. We need to be more agile. I probably would have grown. I probably could have doubled Inospace in the last 18 months again. But I'm taking sort of a more prudent approach to the market. I think, there's opportunity. I think one just needs to sort of batten down the hatches and watch our costs and see that our returns are good and that yields have moved out. But certainly there are three major thrusts for Inospace. I mean, the first is that we are actually now acquiring, we've got in contract 2 assets outside of South Africa. We are focusing on, I've always wanted to in Auction Alliance, but we are focusing on the European market. I think the markets would take up really well. So that's a thrust for us. Obviously earning hard currency and not rands is attractive. The second is actually the tech part of the business, and because Inospace had such thrust into such churn and thrust, we had to develop like our own technology internally to manage the platform. And so we're taking that platform and we're spinning it out and offering it to external companies, both here in South Africa. And that's in fact the brand I'm busy wearing over here is a leasing platform. It's not a brokerage, it's really just a platform for landlords to use, which we haven't even launched yet. So probably that was my international launch with you, Neale. But the tech part is something that we're really growing. The sort of value-added services, which is a huge issue in real estate today, is also something which we're doing. We're launching a logistics offering at one of our parks as a trial. And so sort of the, I call it we've got sort of the 10x strategy. I've got it up on my wall. It's the technology, it's the e-commerce and logistics, and then it's the N stands for one of the countries in Europe, which is the Netherlands, which we're focusing on. That's really the thrust of where Inospace is going to. So we've slowed down on growing those sort of over 52 parks. We may buy more parks in South Africa, but we bring a little moment on that.
Excellent. Well, we've got lots of congratulatory notes and putting yourself out there, Rel, from everybody, which is really nice. If anybody has any specific questions for Rel, just put it in the Q&A box. It's been a very insightful discussion, and Rel, just for putting yourself out there. But let's just talk a little bit about the market at the moment. I mean, you've got a great reputation and understanding of the distressed property market. I mean, how has the crisis affected your tenants within Inospace? That's on the one side. And what opportunities do you think could come up in the market now? I mean, we spoke a little bit about all the different cycles, interest rate hikes and COVID and the global financial crisis, and even back in the day when you started the business in the late 90s, rather early 2000s. So maybe give us a sort of a view and some of your thoughts on that. First of all, how it's affected your tenants within your business parks, and then your take of the distressed market going forward.
Yeah, so I mean, luckily, and I didn't know this when I started the business, luckily we are in the industrial space. And so we don't find any lack of demand from customers. I mean, our occupancy levels are extremely high. They're sort of the late 90s%, or, property people like to talk vacancy. I always query why they like to talk about negative things. I mean, the shop doesn't say it's not what we didn't sell, it's what we did sell. But our occupancy is high. And so we certainly don't find that. We've seen customers, we call tenants customers or clients. So we've seen some of our clients having pressure in their business. The Inospace model has always been that our tenants can come and talk to our clients, can come talk to us if they're having a rough time. Because we have that demand, we would rather actually say let's rather have a sort of an adult conversation. So we haven't seen massive pressure. I mean, even load shedding, when load shedding started at the high stages, I was, here we go. But a lot of industrial tenants, funny enough, they're not that dependent on electricity as an office user would be, or a retail user. So, I mean, I keep on talking to our CFO, and I keep on saying, when's the very rough time coming from our tenants? I do think inflation is a huge issue. For people, it's an issue for us, and so it's caused it's caused a pressure on our returns. It's a compression of our yields. I suppose the big difference today than in Auction Alliance is I never borrowed money in Auction Alliance. I mean, Inospace is a leveraged portfolio. You can't buy 3.25 billion rand without borrowing money from the banks. And so for us, we've got quite a lot of our debt at fixed rates, but we do have some free floating rates, and so it's affected us. And that means that we have to batten down the hatches, because for almost 5% rise in interest rates is a material effect on us, and I believe in our tenants. And so I do think we are certainly not out of the woods in South Africa. I still foresee actually this may actually be the beginning of a longish downturn. I always read that we're not in recession, we are in recession, we're in recession. I mean, there's no question about it. And so I think that it's going to be a rough time, and we have to be on our toes as a business to see to it that our tenants are being able to keep up with, and we will be able to, the question, do we pass inflation onto our tenants? In other words, do we push up rents because we have much shorter WALE or much shorter leases? We've probably got more ability to do that than, say, a fund has got very long leases. So the question now about distress is an interesting one, and And why it's interesting, because I spoke earlier on auction alliance and distress. I mean, the environment in South Africa has changed both from a legal and statutory perspective. I mean, the Business Act, when they changed the Companies Act into business rescue, you don't have this big level of bankruptcy, but distress is distress. And I certainly think that the market is distressed. And I'll give you like a good example. I mean, today we can go to Johannesburg and we can buy a building in a big industrial park at sort of a 4,000 to 5,000 rand a square meter rate. Let's talk about yield. Now, to build that asset today would cost you 12,000 rand just build cost. And so you're buying it at a third of its actual replacement value. That's an indication of distress. Luckily, our banks in South Africa are very much open for business. They seem to be a little bit more robust than the banks in the US. And so people can borrow, but there will be distress around. I mean, office blocks are, to me, they simply are distressed because there's been a cultural shift in how people use offices, and so people are buying up office blocks and repurposing them. I think retail in South Africa is generally sort of kept along, but the truth is that it will be a moment where competition will lessen because people get nervous and people are heading for the exit queue. And so I think that part of it actually makes it an opportunistic time. If you've got the tenacity to face that sort of economic tsunami. Interesting, I sort of Bidvest, I saw Bidvest the other day, they're sort of getting together a war chest, and they're a great example of a business who grew in tough times. And so, if you've got the wherewithal and the ability, these will be the times and the moments. And when we look back and say, even now, I look back, I should have bought more in COVID. It was like, when everybody was locked up under house arrest at home, there were buildings going at really good prices. And so I think it's a moment. And I think people must realize, like, nothing is forever. In fact, the logo of Inospace is a round circle. And it was my story to say life does loop back. And when we're having bad times, we must always remember they're good times. And when we're having good times, we must remember that there are bad times around.
Excellent. I think that's such insightful, and there's just so many golden nuggets within there, Rel. So Rel, we're coming close to the bewitching hour, and we're going to do the final question for you. We still got 80 odd people on here, so nobody's left. Everybody's listening, which is fantastic. I want to thank you, the audience.
It should probably be a good moment, but I'm not.
So my final question for you is, like, first you had success, then catastrophe, bit of suffering, and then you bounce back. But more importantly, you found that tenacity to survive, back up again. Now, you've got to share some, what life and business lessons what you'd like to share with the audience right now in your rise to success. Because I think a lot of people go through the same kind of emotions and cycles as well. And let's take it from somebody who's been through this.
Well, again, I certainly don't want to make it, I'm a guru, but when I wrote the book, a lot of people said, "Are you going to give business, give you business advice?" And I went, "Well, that's a bit arrogant because I'm just far too young to be dispensing advice." Or I'd like to tell myself that. But I did give advice on how to deal with different situations. For me, I've always been biased to action, and you could probably pick that up when I was 18. And so I like to move. People always think I have a huge appetite for risk, but I think one must be risk. But I think one needs to look deep within yourself and come up with a plan. And for me, it was very much, one of the things was like I work on sort of goals and plans, and I spend a lot of time sort of thinking about where the market's going to, and when difficult times come, I take quite a philosophical view on these things. And so for me, it's a lot, sort of several things which I believe in building teams of people and giving people opportunity. I believe in looking at the market and understanding where the trends are. And so I spend a lot of time understanding that. And a lot of it is actually, a lot of it is, it's an interesting conversation, but it's a lot of it not worrying about what other people think, because if I worried about what other people thought of me, I would have never been able to work again. I would have put my head under a rock and disappeared. And so a lot of it is that sort of to say, you know what, I will do what I do, and I will face difficulty no matter how difficult times are. And And really actually to realize that it's in your hardest moments, it's in your most difficult hours. It's in the time when you want to go to bed and not wake up again. It is in those moments that one needs to sort of put on your tackies, hit the streets, put a smile on your dial, fake it till you make it, go out there and because at the end of the day, we are truly all masters of our own destiny. We all control our own destiny. No matter what you want to do, you can control it. And the minute you realize that, the minute you realize it's within your power to do it, you can simply go out and do it. And the environment and the country and the world and everything is a mess up. But if you believe that you can do something and you have the ability to do it, then go out and do it. And that's really something which I adopted. And when I tell people that, it resonates with them because everybody knows the story. It is during our darkest hours. It is during our most difficult times. It is truly when the cards are stacked against us, that it takes that moment, that it takes a tsunami to discover what you're made of.
Incredible. I think that's such a wonderful way to finish, Rael. I think there's some really inspirational stuff there. Rel, thank you very much. I think it's with a mix of gratitude, inspiration that we enjoy the close to this very insightful webinar. And I mean, the past has been filled with really invaluable knowledge, great insights, practical insights that we can use. And I must say, we're immensely grateful for your time and your contribution, Rel. So thank you very much. And I would like to obviously in future get you onto our webinars again. I mean, we've got quite a lot of interesting, a lot of people have asked to reach out, which we'll pass that on to you, Rael. Some people that got some opportunities. But to our audience, we hope you found today's webinar also truly enriching and also gaining a much more deeper understanding of the South African property landscape. And gaining, I mean, this is real practical insight from Rael's experience. And I think he's really opened it to some great thinking. And I would encourage you, please, to get Rael's book. There is a link on the bottom. It's a fantastic read. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a tsunami. I couldn't put it down. I mean, I read it, I think, in less than a week, and it really was an awesome read. So please encourage you, buy Rael's book. It's an enthralling story. It's also full of lessons, full of insights. So as we conclude the session, I just want to remind you also of our upcoming edition of Real Estate Investor Magazine. We're also featuring a story there on Rael as well. And you can access our magazine next week on www.rei.co.za. And furthermore, mark your calendars for our next webinar next week. That's next Thursday, the 22nd of June. To secure your spot, simply click on the registration link. And we're talking about FICA next week. And for those who are brokers and agents, you can also get CPD points on the whole FICA process. So, Rael, once again, it's our heartfelt appreciation to you for generously sharing your time, your expertise, and your experiences today. Thank you very much. I think nobody left the webinar which says that you had everybody enthralled. And, and to our attendees, thank you for being part of our webinars and your continued support. We look forward to welcoming you all back to our future sessions. And as well as you, Rael, love to have you again as a guest. And in the meantime, we wish you safety, success, and fulfillment in all your real estate investment ventures. And we'll meet again next Thursday at 12 o'clock. And this is Neale Petersen and Rael Levitt, CEO of Inospace. We're signing off. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.